Hello and a very warm welcome to the Green Bean. My name is Katie and this little friend is Jack, and we're really glad you're here. Welcome. You're visiting my studio, which is currently based in Devon in the southwest of England, and on this channel I share videos about my creative process and practice, which includes everything from drawing and painting to knitting, sewing, spinning and various other crafts along the way as well. Also in these episodes I like to share some of the nature and wildlife that surrounds us here on the edge of Dartmoor National Park, so I'll be taking you out for a walk on the moors with me and Jack as well. So grab a drink and a project and settle in, and I hope you enjoy this little episode. In today's episode we are talking knitting, and I have a new cast on to share with you, and I can't remember the last time I said that. It feels like I've got 50,000 knitting works in progress, including some secret design projects that I haven't been able to share with you yet. And of course the more projects you have on the go, the less it feels like any of them are moving forward. I was feeling stuck and frustrated with my knitting, and then something unexpected happened. I unfortunately caught COVID and got very sick, and I'm smiling about it. It's not funny at all. It's terrifying, and I'm someone who's very cautious and sensible, and I've carried on holding up restrictions in my life even after they're not legally required anymore. I'm still wearing a mask whenever I possibly can, and obviously I'm vaccinated and boosted, so I've had 3 jabs, and I still somehow managed to catch this horrible disease. So yeah, it just goes to show how virulent and easily transmissible it is. It was very frustrating and I was very unwell. So, long story short, I was craving the comfort of some knitting and feeling grumpy and angry with all of my current projects. So what is one to do in those circumstances but cast on something new? Without further ado, here is the project I cast on. I'm going to show you the back because you can probably see the design a little bit more easily, and you can see it's got 2 whole sleeves already. So this pattern is the Dijon Forêt cardigan by Carol Sunday, which was originally published in an issue of Making magazine. But I discovered it's also now available as an individual pattern because I own a print copy of that magazine, but I'm in the process of preparing to move house and all of my books and magazines are packed. And I had a brief look at the boxes because I've written on them what's in there, but not any specific enough information to locate my copy of the magazine. So I did actually just go on Carol Sunday's website and buy a digital copy of the pattern because it's a whole lot of plain garter stitch, and that was exactly the kind of comfort knitting that I needed while I was poorly. I couldn't, engage my brain for anything particularly complicated. I wanted something that was straightforward stitches, straightforward construction, and going to be a really soothing and comforting knit while I was spending so much time in bed. Unfortunately, when I caught COVID, I was not only unwell with COVID itself, which was a horrible experience, but I was unlucky enough, just as I was beginning to start to recover, I developed a secondary bacterial infection, which for me, if I'm going to get an infection of any kind, it's always in my ears. I've been particularly vulnerable to ear infections my whole life, and this was a really nasty and very painful one, and unfortunately ruptured my eardrum. So part of my COVID recovery has involved obviously antibiotics and coping with a lot of pain and discomfort, and also a loss of hearing on one side. So altogether a extremely unpleasant experience, and one of the many reasons that I needed a comfort knitting project to work on. The other part of my COVID experience was that incredibly and luckily my partner did not catch it, so we lived completely separate lives for 10, 11, 12 days while I was testing positive and really poorly. My partner was okay, so in order to keep them protected, we lived separately. I lived upstairs, my partner lived downstairs, and I was completely alone and very lonely and very frustrated. So this cardigan has been part of my self-care and recovery and getting through this really horrible experience. What I didn't realise before I cast on the pattern is that these little details here on the raglan increases are actually brioche, and I have never knitted any brioche before, ever. I'll be honest and say that most brioche designs don't really appeal to me. They're a lot of usually bright colours, high contrast. I've kind of heard horror stories from people about how difficult it is to unpick and frog your work if something goes wrong, and the combination of those two things was like difficult to unpick, and I don't really like the design in the first place. It was never appealing. So finding out that this was brioche and I really liked it and thought it was beautiful was a real surprise, but it was a little bit of a daunting moment where I was sitting there in bed with all of my painkillers and throat sweets next to me, feeling thoroughly horrible. It's like, oh no, now is not the moment to learn a new knitting technique, Katie. But I will say the pattern was really well written and straightforward. I didn't need to look up any extra information or any tutorials. Everything I needed was there in the pattern, and of course it's only these few pieces. So there's brioche on the raglan increases at the front of the shoulders and the back. The rest of it is plain garter stitch. So once I got my head around it, it was fairly straightforward. There are a couple of tiny mistakes in here, I mean really tiny. There's some pearl stitches that should have been knitted. That's all. I knew the risk. I wasn't going to try and frog back to them to correct them. I was just like, they don't look that bad, it's fine. For my first brioche, I'm very satisfied. So let's talk about yarn choices. I'm using 2 yarns held together for this project, which is not what the pattern calls for, so I was improvising a little bit. The first yarn I picked was Yarnadelic by John Arbon Textiles. This is a sport weight 100% Falklands Corriedale, so it's soft, but it's got a fair amount of squish to it. It's a little bit more tooth and character than 100% merino, but still on that spectrum of softness, which is quite unusual for me. I generally prefer a kind of more crisp and crunchy type of yarn, and I generally gravitate more towards woolen spun than worsted spun. But increasingly I'm finding that worsted spun yarns wear really well in terms of garments. This jumper that I'm wearing is also from a worsted spun yarn, and I have not had to darn it yet, whereas some of my woolen spun jumpers I've had to darn more frequently. So worsted it is for this project. So yes, this yarn is a sport weight and the pattern calls for worsted weight yarn. So this wasn't going to be thick enough on its own, and I wondered about holding it together with some mohair, which is obviously the thing that everybody does. But I don't know, I didn't want it to be that fluffy. So I thought about holding it together with this yarn to add a little bit of fluff, but not too much. This is another yarn from John Arbon Textiles, and this is their Alpaca Supreme, which is a blend of alpaca, obviously, merino and silk. And this particular colour is called Kyanite. It's a kind of, it's definitely grey, but it's got a little hint of green to it. And I wanted the green to skew this colour a little bit more towards green. This is obviously mustard, but it tends a little bit towards the green end of mustard rather than the orange end of mustard, if that makes any sense. And I figured that the 2 of these held together would make a kind of delicate, subtle grey, brown, green, nobody knows what kind of colour it really is, that will fit into my wardrobe extremely well. And it was a bit of a risk deciding to buy those 2 different bases and hold them together. I hadn't seen any swatches or examples of those 2 yarns being held together, so it was very much an experiment. But I could not be more pleased with how it's turned out. As soon as I started to knit up my swatch, I knew that this was going to be a really perfect combination. And as if to bring home that message of how perfect the combination was, I got gauge with my first swatch. I used the recommended needle size, 3.75 millimeters, and I got the exact stitch gauge and row gauge that is called for in the pattern, which has honestly never ever happened to me before. So I felt like my choices were a good one, and this was destined to be a successful project from that point. You might notice there's quite a bit of difference between the fabric of my swatch and the fabric of the cardigan as I'm working on it, and that's because, as with all yarns from John Arbon Textiles, these are not washed as part of the finishing process, so they bloom and fluff up beautifully upon their first wash, which actually changes the character of the yarns quite significantly. So sometimes when I'm working with their yarns, I will actually wash them before knitting. In this case, I was just ready to cast on and needed the comfort of this garter stitch project, so I cast on without washing them, but knowing that they will bloom and fluff up a lot once I wash the finished project. I'm going to attempt a little try on to show you where I'm up to. It's not going to happen very easily because There's a knitting needle in here, and I'm going to lose all of my stitches if I stretch this around me. Maybe this isn't the best thing to do, but you get an idea. I've got the yoke is done and both of the sleeves are finished, and it is actually my preference always to knit the sleeves first, because I kind of reach a little mental block with sleeves. It's a little bit like second sock syndrome. I just find them interminable, so I try to get them out the way first. But that actually wasn't just my choice this time. The pattern does have you knit the sleeves first, which was a nice surprise. I have made a couple of modifications that I want to talk you through. The first of which is that the sleeves are a little bit longer than written in the pattern, just a basic modification because I have long arms. The pattern, however, also had you stop tapering the sleeves and then kind of work straight to the cuff, whereas I like my sleeves to fit quite neatly at the cuff. So I carried on doing the decreases, and when it came right to the cuff, I actually did a final row of very rapid decreases so that it would fit nice and snugly around my cuff, around my wrist. That's what I mean. When it comes to the cuff itself, I made one tiny modification to the pattern, and I'm really pleased with how it turned out. So the pattern has a little bit of like a rolled hem of reverse stocking stitch, which is echoed on the button band. And where it is picked up for the button band on the sample, there's this really neat delineation of the reverse stocking stitch, because it's parallel. No, the other one, the opposite of parallel, perpendicular to the garter stitch of the cardigan. So there's this really neat line, whereas on the cuff, the garter stitch of the sleeve transitioned straight into the reverse stockinette, and there wasn't any delineation between the two. And I wanted to create just a little bit of a distinction between the two stitch patterns, and I did that just by adding an extra row of knit stitches before starting the cuff. It was a complete experiment. I didn't know if it was going to work or not, but I'm really pleased with how it creates just this subtle extra line of shadow between the main body of the sleeve and the cuff to create like an edge, which I'm really pleased with. And now I'm working on the body, which is just smooth sailing, plain garter stitch all the way to the hem, apart from two things. I need to remember to put buttonholes in every, I think I did them every 22 rows. Very important not to forget those. And there will be a little patch pocket on the front as well. But it really is the most basic and comforting of knitting all the way to the end of this project. My final modification will be just knitting it a little bit shorter than the sample. I think the sample goes down to beyond the hip, whereas I prefer my cardigans and jumpers to be slightly cropped, so I'll be knitting it a little bit shorter, but that's the only other change that I'm going to make. I have to say, it has been so nice to knit on something from somebody else's pattern that has nothing to do with work or design, that's just a garment for me and my wardrobe. I realised that the last time I had worked on such a project, it was this jumper that I'm wearing, which is my Caledonia by Sylvia Watts-Cherry that I finished at the beginning of 2021, so well over a year ago. And I basically don't take this jumper off. It's always a sad day when it needs to have a wash, so it will be good to add another kind of basic and fairly neutral, green side of neutral garment into my wardrobe. It's definitely going to be a very wearable project. And I will of course show it to you again either before it's finished or when it's finished. I'm still very much in the process of recovering from COVID. It really knocked me for six. I was very unwell for a week, and then a little bit less unwell but still unwell for another week afterwards, and I'm still recovering and gathering my energy back. So I will be spending a little bit more time in bed or on the sofa working on this project. I sort of have this idea in my head that working on this cardigan is part of my process of recovery. I've been fondly calling it my COVID cardigan, and the idea that I have in my head is that I will not really be fully well and ready to get back to work until this cardigan is finished. So I'm like, that sounds like it's a challenge. That's not really what I'm thinking about. It's more like working on this project has been an act of self-care for me while I was poorly. So yeah, part of the process of caring for myself while I get better is finishing this project. And then I love the fact that through my hands, my skills, my crafts, I can turn what was a really horrible, unpleasant experience into something positive and a treasured piece that I can add to my wardrobe, and is like a embodied experience of caring for myself. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of The Green Bean. I hope you've enjoyed hearing a bit about my current knitting project and spending some time out on Dartmoor with me and Jack. If you'd like to hear from me between now and the next episode, there are two ways to do so. The first of which is to sign up to my newsletter. I've been making a little bit more of an effort with my newsletter since Instagram has become a deeply frustrating place to be as a creative person. Algorithms and complications mean that I'm not seeing the things I want to see, and I don't think people are seeing my work that they want to see either. Anyway, before I descend into a rant, I've been making more of an effort with my newsletter, and the link to sign up for that is down below. I also have a Patreon which supports this channel and makes these videos possible. Supporters on Patreon get access to these videos early and without adverts, and they also get some extended, longer, chatty episodes where I share a bit more behind the scenes of my creative process. So huge thanks if you're one of those lovely folks who supports me over there, and please consider joining us if you would like to contribute to making these videos possible. That's all for now, and I will see you soon. Thanks again. Bye.